She was 63 years old. She had a garden she tended every morning, before the day got loud, before anyone else was awake. She had a pacemaker that had been quietly keeping her heart in rhythm for years. And on what started as an ordinary Tuesday, she was gone. Not missing in the vague, administrative sense. Gone in the way that makes people stop mid-sentence when someone says her name. Gone in the way that leaves a coffee mug sitting on a kitchen counter, unwashed, because no one has figured out how to move it yet, because moving it would mean admitting something nobody is ready to admit. Within hours of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, investigators did something that seemed, on the surface, like a genuine breakthrough. They used the signal from her pacemaker, a real, traceable, pulsing signal, to locate a vehicle. A Kia Soul, parked, specific street, specific time, the kind of lead that makes a case feel solvable. The kind of detail that gives families something real to hold onto when everything else feels like falling. But here's the part that doesn't settle. The FBI, according to reports, traced that signal, confirmed the vehicle, ran the timeline, and then by their own account, stated it led nowhere. Not a dead end with a clean explanation. Not a ruled-out lead with a name attached. Just nowhere. No arrest. No named suspect. No official conclusion about what that signal was doing near that car, or why the car mattered, or whether it mattered at all. And the family is still waiting. That gap between a signal that could be traced and an answer that never came is where this story lives. Nancy Guthrie was not the kind of person who disappeared. That sounds like something people always say after someone goes missing. But the people who knew her say it with a particular kind of exhaustion. The kind that comes from having to repeat something true over and over and still feeling like it doesn't land the way it should. She was rooted. She had routines she kept without fail. She had a house she'd lived in for over a decade, a neighborhood she was genuinely embedded in, and a medical history that required consistent, careful attention. The pacemaker wasn't an afterthought. It was woven into the fabric of her daily life. Doctor appointments, medication schedules, the quiet, unglamorous work of managing a heart, condition with patience and discipline. People who live like that don't just vanish. And yet, her community carries the kind of texture that people outside of it don't always understand right away. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, not carelessly, but out of a long-earned trust, where neighbors recognize each other's vehicles from halfway down the street, where a strange car parked on the wrong block gets noticed, gets mentioned at the hardware store the following morning, where absence is felt quickly because presence is understood deeply. That texture matters because it shapes how the people who knew her processed what happened. When Nancy didn't appear where she was supposed to, the people who noticed weren't strangers trying to be helpful. They were people who had known her for years, who understood her patterns, who felt in their gut that something was wrong before any official report was ever filed. The early search had the particular urgency of personal fear rather than official procedure. Friends retracing her usual routes without being asked. Family members dialing numbers she might have called. That frantic, quiet desperation that exists before the machinery kicks in, before the forms, before the press releases, before the search coordinators with their clipboards and vests. The raw, human version of looking for someone you love. And somewhere inside that early window, investigators began pulling a thread that would become one of the most unusual aspects of the case. Nancy had a pacemaker, and modern pacemakers, depending on their model and configuration, can do remarkable things. They monitor the heart. They record data over time. They transmit signals wirelessly to monitoring systems, sending rhythm readings to servers that cardiologists can access from miles away. Under the right investigative circumstances, they can help establish where a person, or at least where a person's device, was at a specific moment in time. According to reports, that technology became central to the early investigation into Nancy's disappearance. And when investigators followed it, it pointed somewhere specific. A Kia Soul, a location, a timestamp they could work with. It felt, for one fragile moment, like the kind of detail that breaks a case wide open. Before any of this, there was just a woman living her life, quietly, carefully, with the kind of consistency that doesn't make the news but holds entire communities together from the inside out. Nancy had the kind of biography that doesn't announce itself. She wasn't famous. She hadn't built a public legacy or left behind a trail of headlines. She had done the slower, less visible work, raising her family, keeping her friendships, building the kind of quiet credibility that accumulates when you simply show up, year after year, as someone people can count on without question. The garden was real. People who visited her home mention it without being asked, often before they mention anything else. It was the first thing you saw from the driveway, evidence of someone who had put genuine time and intention into a space, not to impress anyone, but because it was hers. That detail means something. It tells you how she moved through the world, carefully, deliberately, with attention to things that would still be there tomorrow. Her health challenges hadn't diminished her the way people sometimes assume a heart condition does. She had adapted. She had absorbed the pacemaker into her life the way you incorporate anything you need to keep going. Not as a limitation that defines you, but as a fact you manage and move past. She attended her checkups faithfully. She understood her own body with clarity. She knew when something felt off, and she communicated that to her doctors with the kind of precise, patient vocabulary that only comes from years of paying very close attention. The people who were close to her returned to one word more than any other: consistent. It appears again and again when people describe her: reliable, present, rooted in what she said she would do and who she said she would be. That's why, when she wasn't where she was supposed to be, the absence registered almost immediately. Not after days of missed calls, not after a gradual, growing worry. Almost immediately, because the people who knew her understood, without needing to analyze it, that her absence fell entirely outside the range of anything she would simply do. She didn't go places without telling someone. She didn't miss appointments without calling. She didn't leave her phone to ring unanswered. The timeline of her last known movements is something investigators have continued to examine carefully, and according to reports, questions about it remain unresolved. She was seen. She was somewhere specific, at a knowable time. And then, within a window that has been scrutinized and studied, she was not. That window is small. That's the part that sits uneasily. Small windows don't usually stay unexplained. Modern cardiac devices are quietly extraordinary. They monitor the heart's rhythm with precision, logging data that most patients never think about, sending that data wirelessly to monitoring systems, to servers, to the cardiologists who check it between appointments. Some devices, depending on their make and programming, can be used under the right circumstances to establish when and where a person was at a given moment. Not perfectly, not without interpretation, but with enough specificity to matter in an investigation. According to reports, Nancy's pacemaker became exactly that, an investigative tool in the hours and days following her disappearance. What investigators were reportedly able to do was trace a signal, to identify, with some degree of technical specificity, that a signal consistent with her device had been detected near a particular location. And near that location, there was a vehicle, a key or soul, a specific description, a narrow time frame, a piece of evidence that arrived with the weight and precision of something that should matter enormously. Think about what that feels like in the middle of a missing persons investigation, when everything is uncertainty and fear and the absence of any clear direction. To suddenly have something traceable, something specific, something that can be written on a whiteboard and pointed at and followed. It changes the entire atmosphere of the search. It gives investigators a thread to pull. It gives families something to focus on that isn't only dread. The key or soul was identified. According to reports, it was traced. The people connected to it were examined. The timeline was laid against what was known about Nancy's last movements and studied carefully. And then, according to what the FBI has publicly stated, it led nowhere. That phrase deserves a moment. Not the lead was investigated and ruled out. Not the vehicle was connected to someone with no involvement. Nowhere. A word that describes not resolution, but absence. The signal was real. The vehicle was real. The connection, whatever it was or wasn't, produced no answer. Investigators have not explained publicly, in meaningful detail, what that means. whether the car was associated with someone who had no known connection to Nancy, whether the pacemaker signal's presence near the vehicle was accounted for in a way that didn't suggest foul play, whether the technology itself carried ambiguities in range or timing that complicated how the evidence could be read. None of that has been clearly stated, and that silence carries its own particular weight. When a lead in a case like this is described as going nowhere, two things can be true at exactly the same time. Investigators may have found something that genuinely didn't connect to what happened, or they may have found something they cannot yet discuss, for reasons rooted in ongoing investigation, legal sensitivity, or the protection of evidence that still matters. Both possibilities exist simultaneously. The family lives inside that uncertainty every single day. Questions have been raised by those close to Nancy and by people following the case more broadly about what the pacemaker data actually showed versus what was reported publicly. Medical device signals are not simple to interpret. They don't always arrive with clean GPS coordinates and precise location stamps. The data requires technical analysis, and technical analysis, even when performed carefully and in good faith, has limits. Was the signal definitively placing Nancy near the key or soul? Or was it placing her device's transmission range near a receiver that happened to be in proximity to the vehicle? Those are meaningfully different questions, and the distinction matters enormously when you're trying to reconstruct the final hours of someone's life. According to reports, investigators consulted with the device's manufacturer to work through the data. That level of technical collaboration suggests the evidence was not straightforward to read. It suggests there were genuine questions, not about whether the signal existed, but about what it meant and what it could prove. The key or soul itself, and the people connected to it, were examined and, according to what has been stated publicly, produced no actionable leads, no charges, no publicly named persons of interest, no statement that explained why evidence that seemed so specific arrived at no conclusion. The family has continued to press for answers. The community has continued to hold Nancy's absence with the particular grief of not knowing, a grief that sits alongside the fear and doesn't resolve the way ordinary grief eventually does. Not knowing is its own place, and people forced to live there are changed by it. Slowly, without announcement. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from waiting for news that never arrives. It's different from grief. Grief, for all its weight, has a shape. It moves through people over time in ways that, eventually, become navigable. But the exhaustion of not knowing, of watching a case develop, and then stall, and then develop again, and then stall again, accumulates differently. It doesn't move through. It settles in. The people who loved Nancy have had to carry the key or soul with them. The pacemaker signal, the specific, almost unbearable detail of a lead that seemed like it should have changed everything. And then, according to official accounts, simply didn't. They've held all of that alongside their actual memories of her. The garden, her consistency, the way she paid close attention to the things and people she cared about. According to people familiar with the case, the family has maintained communication with investigators and has continued to ask for clarity. That is a natural thing to do. It is also a courageous one. It requires energy from people who are already running on very little. It requires them to stay engaged with a process that has returned almost nothing to them. In terms of understanding, the FBI's involvement in the case signals its seriousness. Federal resources don't arrive without reasons. Their presence indicates that investigators believe, or have believed, that the circumstances of Nancy's disappearance warrant that level of attention. But federal involvement also brings a particular kind of institutional silence. Active cases are not discussed publicly with the kind of detail that would give families or communities the clarity they need to breathe. That silence serves legitimate purposes. It protects evidence. It preserves the integrity of any potential future prosecution. But it also means that the people who loved Nancy are left navigating an official quiet that tells them very little about whether the investigation is moving toward something or sitting still. And the pacemaker signal, that specific, remarkable, almost cinematic piece of evidence, remains at the center of all of it, real enough to be traced, significant enough to involve federal investigators, and according to official statements, ultimately unable to provide the answer everyone needed it to provide. Cases like this one have a way of pulling back a curtain on how much complexity lies beneath the surface of ordinary life. Nancy existed in a real community, with real history, real relationships, real routines. She had a medical history that became forensically significant in a way none of us would choose. She had a timeline with a gap in it that hasn't been accounted for. And she had a device that was installed to protect her heart that kept her alive for years, and then became the most specific piece of evidence investigators had after she was gone. There is something almost unbearable about that. The technology designed to sustain her life became the tool used to search for her. The signal meant to tell her cardiologist that her heart was beating correctly became a data point in a federal investigation. Care repurposed into investigation. And then, according to official accounts, arriving without conclusion, questions have been raised beyond this specific case about what situations like Nancy's reveal about medical device data and its role in criminal proceedings. The legal frameworks governing this kind of evidence are still being constructed. Courts have wrestled with questions of consent, of reliability, of what cardiac device data can definitively prove and where its interpretive limits are. The Guthrie case, according to those following it closely, exists squarely within those unresolved questions. That doesn't make the signal less real. It doesn't make the vehicle less traceable. It means that even when investigators have something specific, something that feels like the piece that should complete the picture, the path from that detail to a clear answer is not always straight. The key or soul remains. In the public record, a traced vehicle connected to a signal that led nowhere. The people associated with it have not been publicly named as persons of interest. The FBI's official position, as reported, is that this thread did not produce results that moved the investigation forward in a documentable way. What that means for everything that may still be happening behind the scenes, whether there are other threads being pulled, whether the case is active in ways that haven't been disclosed, whether Nancy's family is closer to understanding than the public record would suggest. None of that is known. What is known is that she is still missing, and the questions surrounding her disappearance remain entirely open. Some stories don't end when the telling of them does. Nancy Guthrie's story continues in the lives of the people who loved her, in the garden that someone is either tending or letting go, in the coffee mug or whatever its equivalent is, the small, specific object that hasn't been moved because moving it would mean accepting something that hasn't been officially confirmed and maybe never will be. The pacemaker signal will stay in this story for a long time, not because it provided an answer, because of how close it seemed to one. To have that kind of precise, technical, traceable detail, the kind that crime dramas are built around, and to watch it resolve into silence. That isn't dramatic. It isn't sensational. It's just heavy in the way that real things are heavy. Cases like this one sit in the gap between what we believe technology can do and what it can actually deliver. We live in a time when it feels like everything should be traceable, like every device, every signal, every digital imprint should eventually lead somewhere clear and knowable. And sometimes it does. And sometimes, for reasons that are legal, technical, interpretive, or simply unknown, it doesn't, and a family is left sitting in that gap indefinitely. The FBI's statement that the lead went nowhere doesn't close this case. It closes a door. And in investigations like this one, closed doors don't always mean empty rooms. They sometimes mean rooms that haven't been opened yet, for reasons that have nothing to do with what might be inside them. Nancy deserves an answer. The people who loved her deserve one. The community that felt her absence almost immediately, that searched before the search was official, that has held her in memory with a grief that is specific and personal and ongoing. That community is still waiting, without resolution, without relief, just waiting. There is no conclusion here. There is only the story as it stands. A woman, a signal, a vehicle, a silence that has lasted far too long, and somewhere underneath all of it, quiet, persistent, refusing to let go, the hope that one day the silence